Lucia cared for 3 generations. She was there for the first steps, the first fever, the first "I love you." For 20 years they called her part of the family, until an anonymous call removed her from the house like a criminal. But what hurt the most wasn't the deportation, it was the silence from those she loved most. If you enjoy compelling stories, please like, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our content. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Lucia stepped off the plane with lips cracked from the dry air of the flight and hands swollen with anxiety. It was 6 in the morning when she set foot on American soil for the first time. The Houston airport appeared to her like a miniature city. White lights everywhere, voices she couldn't understand, endless corridors that smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. She was 29 years old, with a passport containing a tourist visa she had obtained through a chain of favors and debts, and a heart heavy with everything she was leaving behind. She came from San Pedro Sula, where police sirens wailed every night and gangs controlled even the silences. But that wasn't what made her flee. It was a more intimate fear, the kind that waits for you inside your own home. Her husband, Joel, had been a charming man for the first 3 months. Then came the shouting, the threats, the pushing, then the beatings, first with his hand, later with whatever was within reach. Her oldest son, Elvin, just 8 years old, found her one night lying on the patio floor after a beating. It was then that Lucia understood that if she didn't leave, she would end up dead. Her mother found her the contact of a distant aunt in Houston, a woman who sold tamales in a Mexican market and offered a roof for a few days in exchange for help in the kitchen. Lucia sold everything she could, her old refrigerator, her double bed, her washing machine, even some small jewelry pieces her grandmother had given her. With that, she paid for the visa application, the plane ticket, and a second-hand suitcase she bought at a flea market. She left everything else behind, her country, her children, her identity. At the airport, passing through immigration, the officer barely looked at her. He asked why she was coming. "Tourism," she answered nervously, repeating the phrase she had rehearsed so many times. They stamped her passport and wished her a good trip. No one suspected. No one asked more questions. That first night in the United States, she slept on a couch in a living room shared by 3 women and a small child who wouldn't stop crying. The aunt who received her offered food, but made it clear she had only 3 days to figure out her situation. That's how things were. Nobody could afford to support another mouth. In those first days, Lucia walked the streets of Houston with her phone in hand, following directions she didn't fully understand, looking for work in houses she found on flyers or from what other women at the market told her. She cleaned bathrooms for $20, cared for an elderly man with Alzheimer's who insulted her in English, and washed dishes in a kitchen where they wouldn't even let her have a glass of water. She ate leftovers. She slept on borrowed floors. She felt like a shadow among other shadows. Every night she called her mother to ask about the children. She told them she was fine, that she had arrived at a nice place, that she would send money soon. She didn't talk about the fear she felt when going out on the street, or the trembling that ran through her body whenever she saw a police car. Much less did she speak of how alone she felt. One morning, while cleaning a bathroom in a middle-class apartment, she accidentally overheard 2 women talking in the living room. One of them, visibly stressed, mentioned that she urgently needed a live-in maid to care for her children and manage the house. Lucia approached timidly when the other woman left. "Excuse me, ma'am. If you're still looking, I need work. I can do anything." The woman looked her up and down. She had perfectly straight hair, a white designer blouse, long, well-maintained nails. Lucia lowered her gaze. "Do you have papers?" she asked in a neutral tone. "No, ma'am, but I'm very eager to work, and I'm very responsible." There was a pause. The woman took a paper from her purse, wrote down an address and a time. "Come tomorrow at 7. Don't be late." Lucia slept with that paper under her pillow. The next day, she put on her best blouse, ironed her pants with the heat from a pot, and arrived half an hour early at the address. It was a house in a private development, with aligned trees and luxury cars parked outside. She rang the doorbell with frozen fingers. The door opened, and a thin woman in her 40s looked down at her. "Are you the girl who called me?" she asked with a marked accent. Lucia nodded. They let her in. The interior of the house was like a museum. White furniture, expensive paintings, hospital-like silence. "I have 2 children. I work all day. I need someone to live here. There's a small room in the backyard. Are you interested?" "Yes, ma'am. Of course I am. 200 a week, food included, but I need you to be discreet. No problems." "There won't be any," she promised. They showed her the little room. It was tiny, with a narrow bed, a broken table, an old fan. But it had its own bathroom. And there was no one else. Lucia walked in and knew that for the first time since she arrived, she was going to sleep peacefully. That night, she didn't call her mother. She sat on the edge of the bed and hugged herself. She closed her eyes and felt something new, a mixture of relief, fear, and a small spark of hope. Maybe this place would give her what she was looking for, stability. Maybe the 2 years she promised herself she would spend there would be enough to change her destiny. She didn't know that destiny had already begun to write a story that would mark her forever. A story where love, betrayal, and indifference would mix with long silences and looks that hurt more than any blow. And she still didn't know that her promise of just 2 years would turn into 2 decades of invisibility. The room where Lucia slept was barely 10 by 10 feet. The walls were unpainted brick, and in winter, the wind seeped through a crack by the door, making the air feel like ice. The mattress creaked every time she moved, and a single old blanket, a gift from Mrs. Teresa, covered her at night. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't pretty, but it was hers. For the first time in a long time, she felt she had a small piece of space where no one could yell at her or push her or judge her. There, she could sleep without fear. The routine in the house started early from the first day. By 5 in the morning, Lucia was already up, with feet swollen from the cold floor and hands marked by the previous day's bleach. First was preparing coffee for Mrs. Teresa and her husband, Mr. Esteban. Then preparing breakfast for the children, scrambled eggs, beans, toast, sometimes fruit. At 6:30, the house began to fill with hurried footsteps, backpacks, complaints from sleepy children, and urgent emails that Teresa read aloud from her phone. Lucia quickly learned everyone's preferences. Diego wouldn't eat bread with seeds. Sofia hated cold milk. Mr. Esteban preferred his coffee without sugar, and if served with milk, he would leave it untouched. Teresa was obsessed with order. Towels had to be perfectly aligned, shirts ironed with creases, and the pantry in complete silence. The house had unwritten rules. Lucia had to make herself invisible when there were visitors. She couldn't sit in the living room. She shouldn't talk on the phone near the children. But there were also moments of tenderness, like when Sofia hugged her from behind while she was cooking, or when Diego left little drawings on her small table with messages that said, "I love you, Aunt Lucia." That nickname, Aunt Lucia, was Teresa's idea, who suggested it during the 2nd month of work. So you don't have to explain anything. Tell them you're their aunt, that you come from far away. It's easier for everyone that way. And it was. The children accepted her immediately. Over time, it was Lucia who woke them up, dressed them, prepared their lunches, took them to the bus stop, and picked them up in the afternoon. Teresa and Esteban were almost never around. They were a family present only in portraits, absent in the days. Lucia didn't just take care of the house. She took care of this family's very life. Without papers, without a contract, without insurance, without guarantees, Lucia knew she was walking a tightrope. One misunderstanding, one inspection, one anonymous report was all it would take for everything to end in seconds. But instead of sinking into fear, she clung to what she had. She transformed this job into her refuge, a strict, almost military routine that gave her structure, a notebook where she recorded every expense, weekly calls to Honduras to check on her children, monthly money transfers that tore at her soul, because they meant giving up buying new shoes or visiting the doctor when her chest hurt. As the months passed, she became indispensable to the family. The neighbors knew who she was, though they didn't know much about her story. Some greeted her with respect, others with distance. "She's the Rivas girl," they would say. Never the lady, never the worker, just the girl, as if time didn't pass for her, even though her face was already showing the first grey hairs and the dark circles that never disappeared. Every December, when the holidays came, Lucia prepared tamales with her mother's recipe. The children helped her, got their hands dirty, laughed, asked questions. Teresa took photos and sometimes posted them on social media with phrases like, "Our big family." In those moments, Lucia felt part of something. A small gear, but necessary. She dreamed that someday, somehow, they would help regularize her situation. Maybe when the children grew up, maybe if Esteban talked to a lawyer, but she never asked, never wanted to inconvenience anyone. The years passed, first 1, then 3, then 5. By then, she had decorated her little room with photos of her children, religious cards, and an old radio that kept her company while she washed clothes. She knew the family's schedules by heart. She recognized the sound of Esteban's car engine, Teresa's accelerated pace when she was upset, the tone of Sophia's voice when something hurt her, and Diego's look when he was afraid to go to school. She became the silent shadow that kept this house afloat, an invisible engine, a heart that no one noticed, until someday it would stop beating there. And although she never said it out loud, every night she repeated the same phrase to herself as she lay down in her narrow bed with her body aching from fatigue. "Just a little longer. When I save enough, I'll leave." But she didn't leave. Not the following year, not the next. Because hope, when mixed with need, becomes a chain. And Lucia, without knowing it, was no longer free. She was tied to a family that needed her, but didn't see her, and to a country that didn't want her, but wouldn't let her go either. Lucia was never included in the family portraits. She was in all the photos, yes, in the background, out of focus, wearing her apron and with busy hands, but never framed, never on the shelf, never in the living room. That's how things were for someone like her. You lived in the corners, you existed in the margins. 20 years had passed since she crossed the border with a tourist visa and a promise to work for a couple of years, save some money, and return to Honduras. But that promise stayed tucked away with her papers in a box she hid under the bed, along with old photos, unsent letters, and 2 Honduran bills she kept out of nostalgia. 20 years, 730 times waking up in the same 10 by 10 room, more than 1,000 Sundays watching others celebrate while she ironed clothes or cleaned bathrooms. 4 presidents in the United States, a mother who died without being able to say goodbye, 2 sons who became men without having her near. During those 2 decades, Lucia became an omnipresent figure in the Rivas household. She was the one who opened the curtains every morning and turned off the lights at night. The one who cooked soup when someone was sick and who placed gifts under the Christmas tree so the children would believe they came from Santa Claus. She was the one who knew the exact order of the sheets on each bed, the sound of each lock, the smell of each detergent, everyone's schedules. She didn't just keep the house clean, she kept routine, order, peace alive. But legally, she didn't exist. She had no social security number, no bank account, no medical history. She never filed taxes. She never voted. She never signed a single paper in her name. She didn't even have a copy of her own contract because there never was one. just a verbal agreement that over the years became normalized until it was part of the air everyone breathed. But no one dared to question. Fear at first was constant. Every time someone rang the doorbell forcefully, her heart would race. She thought they were coming for her, that they would take her away, that everything would end. But then nothing happened, and so she built a routine based on caution. Don't go out, don't talk too much, don't draw attention. Over time, fear ceased to be an emotion and became a condition. Like hunger, like cold. You learned to live with it. The neighbors knew her, of course. Some greeted her with a slight gesture from their gardens. Others asked if she could also clean their houses from time to time. But she always said no. Not for lack of desire, but out of loyalty. Her place was there. That house was her world, her border, her hiding place. And within that hiding place, she watched Sofia and Diego grow up as if they were her own. She taught them to tie their shoelaces, to read cereal labels, to fold clothes, not to leave the water running. She was there for their first days of school, their nightmares, their colds, their tears, but she was also there for their birthdays, their board games, their movie afternoons. She was the one who knew what kind of toothpaste they liked and which they didn't, the one who noticed when something was bothering them, even when no one else did. And yet, she was never officially part of anything. When Sofia turned 15, the family organized an elegant party. They rented a hall, hired a band, a photographer, a catering service. Lucia spent weeks ironing napkins, gluing flowers to centerpieces, polishing rented silverware. On the day of the event, she worked from 6 in the morning and didn't sit down for a second. When they finished serving the cake, she went to the staff bathroom, looked at herself in the mirror, and said quietly to herself, "Happy 15, my girl." Then she returned to the kitchen, where she ate what was left over on a plastic plate, while everyone danced outside. She was never invited to family gatherings. She was never mentioned in toasts. Teresa once said, "She already knows we love her, we don't need to say it all the time." But it was necessary, because silence over the years weighs like a shared guilt. The only gift she received at Christmas was an envelope with folded bills and a polite smile. And it's not that she expected more. No, Lucia wasn't naive. She knew her place very well. She knew her presence was tolerated as long as she was useful. She knew the affection she received was conditional on her function. She knew there was no inheritance, no rights, no future. She knew that if she ever became seriously ill, there would be no hospital to attend to her, no lawyer to defend her. She knew that if someday someone knocked on that door with an official order, no one would intervene. But she also knew something deeper, more difficult to accept, that she had given 20 years of her life, and that despite everything lived, she never stopped being the lady who helps around the house. At the end of each day, closing the door to her room, she would sit on the edge of the bed and take a deep breath. She looked at her altar with a half-melted candle and a card of St. Jude Thaddeus. She closed her eyes and for a few seconds imagined a different world, one where her papers were in order, where her children lived nearby, where someone cared about her without her having to earn it every day. But when she opened her eyes, reality remained the same. And the next day, at 5 in the morning, the cycle began again. Without applause, without recognition, without a name on any payroll. This is how invisibility is lived. Not as a sudden punishment, but as a slow erosion of the soul. And the saddest thing is that when one realizes one has become so accustomed that it hurts more to imagine freedom than to continue being invisible. It was just an ordinary morning. One of those like so many others when Lucia got up before the sun, prepared breakfast in silence and opened the curtains with the same routine gesture she had repeated for 20 years. The aroma of freshly made coffee mingled with the soft sound of the fan in the kitchen. The house was still asleep. Teresa and Esteban hadn't come down. The children, now teenagers, were getting ready for school. Lucia had left 2 packed lunches on the table, freshly squeezed orange juice and sticky notes with caring messages. "Don't forget your test. I believe in you," for Sofia. "Remember you can handle anything," for Diego. Small gestures that no one asked for, but which had become part of her daily life, part of her silent love. She wore a faded pair of jeans, her favorite blue blouse, the least worn of all, and had her hair pulled back in a loose braid. She was leaning over the sink, washing breakfast dishes, when a dry, loud noise broke her concentration. Boom, boom, boom! 3 forceful knocks on the front door. They weren't like Teresa's when she forgot her keys, nor like the children playing. They were authoritative, unexpected, unsettling. Lucia stood still with wet hands. Her knuckles trembled as she put a plate on the drying rack. Her heart began pounding in her ears. "Immigration, open the door! Federal agents!" The shout was repeated, this time louder, closer. Lucia felt her feet disappear from under her. It was as if everything she had feared for years was manifesting all at once, in stereo, in her own home. Teresa came down the stairs with a distorted face. Esteban followed her, still in pajamas. "What's happening?" he asked, trying to understand. The children came down too, alerted by the noise. Sofia looked at Lucia with big eyes, seeking answers. "Aunt, what's happening?" But Lucia couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She just clutched her apron between her fingers and took a step back. "Mrs. Rivas, we have an inspection warrant. We received a report. Open the door or we'll force our way in." Esteban approached with raised hands. He opened the door. 3 ICE agents immediately entered, with vests, visible weapons and folders in hand. The air became dense, the atmosphere unreal, as if they were all inside a movie. But it wasn't. One of the agents raised his voice. "We're looking for Lucia Hernandez, Honduran citizen. She is here under irregular status." Lucia's world collapsed in that instant. Teresa said nothing. She didn't protest. She didn't ask questions. She just looked at the agents and then lowered her gaze. Esteban crossed his arms. Diego remained paralyzed. Sofia, on the other hand, ran to her and hung from her neck. "Don't take her away. She didn't do anything. She lives here." The agents approached calmly but firmly. One of them spoke in a low, almost kind voice, as if that would ease the fact. "Mrs. Hernandez, you have to come with us. There's a federal order." "Can I put on my shoes?" asked Lucia in a whisper. "Of course, but quickly, please." She walked to the little room in the backyard. She surveyed it one last time. She grabbed her worn black shoes, the same ones she had walked thousands of days in that house. She put them on slowly, feeling that each movement was a farewell. She didn't take clothes. She didn't take her box of memories. She didn't take anything. Before leaving, she looked for Sofia, who was crying without understanding. "I love you, as if you were my own," she whispered in her ear. "Never forget that." She hugged her tightly for the last time. Diego didn't move. He didn't approach. He just watched her from the stairs with glassy eyes. Teresa remained motionless, like a frozen figure, as if the scene had nothing to do with her. Esteban took his phone and pretended to make a call. No one else spoke. When crossing the door, handcuffed, Lucia didn't plead. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She had already cried it all before. The only thing she felt was a bitter mixture of resignation and disappointment. In the patrol car, as they drove away, one of the agents told her, "We received an anonymous tip. Someone reported that you were residing at this address without documentation." Lucia didn't ask who it was. There was no need. In that house only 5 people lived, and children don't make reports. She knew, she felt it, and it hurt more than anything else. At the detention center, they processed her like a criminal. They took her belongings. They sat her on a cold bench. Around her, other women waited, equally confused, equally broken. They allowed her to make a call. She dialed Teresa's number. No one answered. She tried 2 more times. Nothing. No message, no explanation, no promise of help. The guard took the phone from her without a word. Lucia just lowered her head. In a few hours, 20 years of life crumbled without anyone doing anything to stop it. The cell was cold, not because of the climate, but because of the air that was breathed in there. It was a mixture of dampness, disinfectant, and resignation. Lucia sat on the concrete bench attached to the wall and hugged her knees like a child. There were other women in the place. Some cried silently, others murmured prayers. No one talked too much. They all knew that in these places, noise could turn against you. She wasn't handcuffed, but she felt more trapped than ever. In her hand, she still had the fabric bracelet that Sophia had made for her weeks before with colored beads. She squeezed it tight, as if it were the only thing that still connected her to something more than this present that was devouring her. Hours before, her entire world was a perfectly designed routine. She knew the order of each day, the steps of each person in the house, the permitted silences. Suddenly, everything had exploded, and now she was just another number in a federal database. She called Teresa 3 times from the detention center office. 3. No one answered. The first time it rang until the voicemail. The second, it went straight to voicemail. The third, it didn't even ring. Number unavailable. Lucia remained silent, with the phone still at her ear. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just understood. That family, the one that for 20 years had called her part of the house, the one that had asked her to stay on Christmas Eve, to not leave the children alone, the one that had promised her, "We'll see how to fix your papers," hadn't lifted a finger for her. No one came to see her. No one called a lawyer. No one asked about her. That night she slept on a thin mattress in a room without windows, with fluorescent light on all the time. They gave her a thick paper blanket that barely covered her feet. The food came on a plastic tray with cold rice, stale bread, and a sugary drink. No one explained anything. No one said how long she would be there. They just assigned her a number, a case identification, and repeated that the law will follow its course. On the second night, another woman, Maria, lent her a sweater. "It's colder in here than on the street, isn't it?" she said with a broken smile. Lucia nodded. Maria had been waiting for a hearing for 3 weeks. She was the mother of 2 children born in California. She worked at a laundromat. She had been detained on her way to work. "And you?" she asked. Lucia took a deep breath. "I lived in the same house for 20 years. I took care of 2 children since they were babies." "And no one came for you?" Lucia looked down. No one. Silence was her only answer. But in her eyes there was something more than sadness. There was betrayal. The days in the center passed slowly. Always the same protocol, always the same faces, the same smell, the same feeling of not belonging anywhere. One afternoon, a volunteer offered to write a letter to someone. "You can write to your family," she said. Lucia thanked her but didn't write. To whom? For what? Her mother was no longer there. Her children had made their lives far away. And the Rivas? They didn't deserve her words. After a week, a social worker approached with a different tone. "Your employers haven't called," she said straightforwardly, "but someone shared your story. A local reporter wants to talk to you." Lucia was surprised. "A reporter?" "Yes. It seems there's interest. The family's children, the teenagers, uploaded a video asking for your release." Lucia felt something she couldn't name. Hope? Confusion? Pain? And their parents? The social worker looked at her with a certain compassion. Nothing from them. And the next day, they allowed her to see the video on a phone under supervision. Sophia appeared, with her hair tied back and eyes swollen from crying. Next to her, Diego, more serious, quieter. Both spoke to the camera. "She raised us," said Sophia with a trembling voice. "She is our family. What they're doing to her is not fair." "We didn't know this could happen," added Diego. "We didn't know she didn't have papers. But that doesn't change what we feel for her. We want her to come back." Lucia let out a silent tear. Just one. No more. She caressed with her eyes the image of those children whom she had seen take their first steps, who hugged her when they were afraid, who asked her for stories before going to sleep. But she also knew what she had seen on the day of the raid: Teresa's silence, Esteban's distance, the lack of a single word, not a defense, not an explanation, not an attempt. In a preliminary hearing, the assigned public defender explained the basics. She had no criminal history, but she had remained in the country for more than 20 years without documentation. There was no asylum application, no protection, no legal ties to citizens. Your case is very difficult, he told her. The law is not in your favor. Lucia nodded. She didn't protest. She didn't beg. She only asked for one thing. Can I have a hearing where they are present? I want to see their faces. The lawyer frowned. They're not obligated to show up. I know, she said, looking down, but sometimes silence also says everything. Back in the cell, she hugged herself. She thought about how she had given herself completely to that family, how she had devoted herself to other people's children while her own grew up without her. She thought about each birthday she celebrated alone, each December without a hug, each promise of, I'll return next year. Now, in the end, the price she paid wasn't just deportation. It was understanding that she had loved more than she had been loved. If you're enjoying this story, please like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all our content. The news didn't first appear on television, not in newspapers, not on official government pages. It appeared in a video recorded with a cell phone from the living room of a house where once there had been laughter, breakfasts, and calm routines. The video began with Sofia sitting on the same couch where she used to watch movies, hugging Lucia. She had a pale face, her hair in a messy ponytail, and eyes red from crying. Next to her was Diego, taller, more serious, but equally hurt. Both spoke directly to the camera, with simple words, no script, from the heart. My name is Sofia Rivas, she said. I'm 17 years old, and this woman, she pointed to a photo of Lucia in her hands, took care of me since I was a baby. She raised us, added Diego. She was with us every day of our lives. She taught us to walk, to read, to cook. She was there when we got sick. She was there when our parents couldn't be. They paused. The silence felt like an echo. Today, Lucia is detained by immigration, continued Sofia, because someone reported her, because she lived without papers. But she's not a criminal, interrupted Diego with a firm voice. She's part of our family. She has no one else. We are her people, and she is ours. The video, barely 3 minutes long, was uploaded to social media by a friend from school. In less than 12 hours, it already had more than 500,000 views. In 24, it exceeded 1 million. Activists, artists, influencers, and journalists shared it. The story of the nanny who raised 2 children and ended up in a detention center touched a collective nerve that had been accumulating anger and sadness for a long time. Some commented with rage, 20 years in a house and no one defended her. Such hypocrisy. They use her, then abandon her. That family has no soul. Others offered help. My cousin is a lawyer. I can represent her. Where do we sign so they don't deport her? She deserves to stay more than many who were born here. And many others simply cried in front of the screen, recognizing in Lucia someone from their own lives. An aunt, a mother, a neighbor, a friend. Lucia's face, in that photo that Sofia was holding, went viral. News networks picked up the story. They interviewed Sofia and Diego, protected their legal identity as minors, but broadcasted their words. The newscasts called her the invisible caregiver. A Spanish-language journalist with tears in his eyes, closed his segment saying, Lucia represents thousands, women who gave their lives for other families, women who loved in silence and who were forgotten when they needed it most. The outrage grew so much that a virtual petition was organized to stop the deportation. In less than 5 days, they gathered more than 400,000 signatures. People from all states in the United States left their names and messages. "This is not justice, it's cruelty. I signed for my mother, who was also a nanny without papers. Lucia deserves to stay. She's a hero without a cape." Congress received the petition. Some representatives spoke out, though with caution. The immigration system was complex, they said. Each case had to be reviewed. Meanwhile, at the detention center, Lucia still didn't know the magnitude of what was happening out there. They informed her that something had moved, that the media was talking about her, that the children were doing everything possible, but she didn't dare to hope. "Fame doesn't stop planes," she said quietly to a companion. "But it can change the route," replied the other with a weak smile. One afternoon, a lawyer arrived at the center. It wasn't the public defender they had assigned her. This one was sent by a human rights organization with the help of anonymous donations. He was young, Mexican-American, spoke with a border accent and a firmness that commanded respect. "I'm going to represent you, Lucia. I don't guarantee miracles, but you're not alone." She looked at him with distrust. "Who will pay for that?" "People." "What people?" He took out his phone. He showed her the petition, the videos, the news, the messages. He showed her the faces of those who didn't know her but were defending her. Lucia cried for the first time since they had detained her. She really cried, with her entire body, standing against the wall, with her hands on her face. She wasn't just crying for the gesture. She was crying for everything she never thought would come. "And the Rivas?" she asked between sobs. Silence. "Not a word," replied the lawyer. That silence weighed more than any cell. The defense began immediately. The lawyer requested an urgent hearing with the presence of the minors. The judge accepted, moved by the social context. It wasn't usual, but it wasn't impossible. It was scheduled for the following week. The day before the hearing, Sophia sent a handwritten letter that reached the center through the legal team. It was short, clumsy in its handwriting, but honest. "Dear Lucia, not a day goes by that I don't think of you, of how your rice pudding smelled, of how you knew something was wrong with me without me saying anything. I'm angry, I'm sad, but I'm also determined. We're going to fight. Not because you're my nanny, but because you're my family. I love you, Sophia." Lucia read that letter at least 100 times that night. She didn't sleep. She just waited for dawn, with something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was a cloudy Wednesday. The hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock sharp, but from 7 in the morning there were already people waiting outside the Houston Immigration Court. It wasn't common for a case like Lucia's to attract so many people. Deportations were usually silent, almost mechanical, buried in bureaucracy. But that day, something was different. The story was no longer just Lucia's. It was the story of thousands, of absent mothers, of invisible workers, of women who gave everything for families that weren't their own, and who in the end were left with nothing. A line of cameras surrounded the entrance. Reporters waited with microphones in hand. Some activists held signs with phrases like, "Justice for Lucia," "She raised your children, it's not illegal to love." Among the crowd, there were Latin mothers with scarves on their heads, young people with backpacks who seemed to have come from school, women who arrived by public transportation with their children by the hand. All were, in a certain way, reflections of her. Inside, the hearing room was fuller than usual. The back benches were occupied by members of human rights organizations, legal volunteers, and even court workers who, though silent, wanted to listen. Lucia entered escorted by 2 officers from the detention center. She wore loose beige pants and a plain white blouse. Her hair was braided, her gaze firm. She had a pale face, but her eyes were clearer than ever. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't complaining. She had come this far with dignity, and that's how she intended to stay. On the other end, Sofia and Diego entered. They weren't with their parents. They were accompanied by a social worker and a private lawyer that the family had hired at the last minute, pressured by the public reaction. Teresa and Esteban didn't show their faces. They preferred not to attend. Their absence was like a thunderous silence that filled everything. The judge was an African-American woman in her 60s. She had a severe but attentive expression. She had been in that court for years, and few cases had stopped the room like this one. "Let's begin," she said with a firm voice. "This hearing is not to determine guilt, but to hear arguments in the humanitarian context. I understand that the minors wish to testify." Sofia was the first. She stood in front of the bench with a crumpled sheet in her hands. Her fingers trembled, but her voice was clear. "My name is Sofia Rivas. I'm 17 years old, and I want to tell you who Lucia is." She took a deep breath. "She taught me to read. She taught me to speak Spanish. She healed me every time I got sick. She combed my hair for my school presentations. She made my first costume. She comforted me when I had my first failure. She hugged me when I was afraid. She's not just someone who worked in my house. She's my family." It was hard for her to speak, but she continued. "If she leaves, we don't just lose a person. We lose someone who gave us love when we needed it most. We lose a part of who we are." The judge observed her attentively. She didn't interrupt. Diego stood up afterward. He didn't read anything. He spoke from the gut. "I never thought I would end up speaking here, but if I remained silent, I would be part of the problem. My dad says all of this is legal, that this is how the law is. But I don't understand how a law can say that someone like Lucia has to leave, when she was the one who gave us everything." There was a silence, and then he said something that broke the air. "She was more of a mother than our own mother." The judge blinked. The prosecutor cleared his throat. A woman on the back bench let out a choked sigh. The prosecution asked to speak. A young lawyer, visibly moved, stood up. "This case, Your Honor, is a human paradox. Mrs. Hernandez has violated the immigration law of this country. There is no doubt. She entered legally, but remained beyond the permitted limit. However," and here her voice changed tone, "we cannot ignore what we have heard today. We cannot pretend we didn't see the eyes of these young people. We cannot pretend she is just another number." The judge nodded, but her face didn't soften. "The law is clear," she finally said, "and as the prosecutor well said, this court does not judge emotions, but facts." She made a long pause. "Mrs. Hernandez has remained in this country for 2 decades without documentation. She has not applied for asylum, nor residence, nor has she initiated any regularizing procedure. She does not have direct citizen relatives, nor has she been registered as a legal caregiver. There is not enough legal basis to stop her deportation." Lucia wasn't surprised. She had already sensed it. But Sofia was. Sofia broke down crying. Diego clenched his teeth with contained rage. The judge continued. "However," she said, "this court recognizes the emotional and social impact of the case. Therefore, I will recommend that a deferred action for humanitarian reasons be explored, although its execution depends on other instances. Here, I cannot stop the inevitable, but I can record what we have all seen, that this woman is not a threat, that she is a human being, and that she deserves respect." With that, the hearing was adjourned. There was no applause, there were no hugs. Just a heavy murmur like that of a cemetery. Lucia was escorted back to the rear. Sofia ran to hug her before they took her away. "Don't forget me," she said in tears. "You never left me," responded Lucia, kissing her forehead. They led her down a long corridor. The echo of her footsteps was the only sound. Behind remained the shouts of support, the crying of the children, the cameras, the signatures, the petitions. But for her, there was no more defense, only dignity. The sun had not yet risen when Lucia was awakened by the guard. It was 4:30 in the morning. They gave her a simple change of clothes, jeans, white t-shirt, and a thin fabric jacket. They didn't allow her to wear the one she had on the day of her arrest, nor to take her personal objects. "That gets sent later," they told her, though she knew that often those belongings were lost forever in the limbo of detention centers. They gave her 20 minutes to get ready. They didn't offer breakfast or coffee. They just escorted her in silence to a narrow corridor that smelled of dampness and fatigue. An officer explained that this was the standard protocol for voluntary deportations, although in her case, there was nothing voluntary about it. She didn't sign anything. She just accepted the inevitable. They put her in a white van along with 6 other women. 3 were handcuffed, 2 others cried, "Lucia, no." Lucia looked out the window, though there was nothing to see beyond the foggy glass. The vehicle moved along the highway, through the thick fog and the sleepy buildings of a city that had seen her live, without ever really seeing her. When they arrived at the airport, they separated them into groups. The so-called administrative removals had a special protocol: discreet departures, no contact with the press, no opportunity to see anyone. But that day wasn't the same. Outside the building by a metal fence, more than 30 people were waiting for her in silence. It wasn't a demonstration. There weren't big banners, nor shouts, nor disturbances. Just people, neighbors, women like her, men with their children, young people who had seen her story on social media. A lady held a handmade sign that said, "You are part of this community." Lucia saw them from a distance. She couldn't approach. She couldn't greet them. The officers quickened the pace but didn't prevent that. For an instant, their gazes met with those of the group. And in that crossing of eyes, there was something stronger than words: recognition. They had ignored her for years, but now they saw her. No longer as the girl who helps, but as a woman who existed, who struggled, who had a name and a face. A reporter tried to take a photo. They pushed him back. "No access!" shouted an officer. Lucia kept her head high. Her hands weren't handcuffed, but her steps were those of a prisoner morally condemned, not for having done harm, but for having been in the wrong place, under a system that doesn't forgive shadows. When they boarded her on the plane, a special flight contracted by ICE, they assigned her a window seat. The engine roared before dawn. The takeoff was quick, without announcements, without goodbyes. As the plane rose, Lucia saw how the city that had been her refuge for 2 decades became small. She didn't cry. She couldn't. It was as if her body no longer had water, as if the sorrow had dried up from accumulating so much. She was flying towards Tegucigalpa, a country she hadn't set foot in for 20 years, a land that no longer felt like hers, where no one was waiting for her. During the flight, she thought about the little room in the backyard, about the shelf where she kept her box with photos, letters, and objects she had been collecting over the years. She thought about her old radio, about the flowered curtain, about the blanket Sophia had given her on a birthday. None of that was going with her. Everything was left behind, and she also thought about the exact moment when her world changed. That morning when the door sounded with violence and Teresa's silence said it all. The plane landed without applause. Once on the ground, the agents handed each woman over to the local immigration authorities. A brief, mechanical procedure. They didn't even look her in the eyes. Lucia signed some documents she didn't fully understand. They returned her expired passport and an envelope with the dollars she had in her detention center account. 116. That was all she had left. She left the airport dragging an old suitcase they had given her in Houston. She didn't have a cell phone. She didn't have updated contacts. Just a handwritten address of a distant cousin who might still be living on the outskirts of San Pedro Sula. She asked for a shared taxi. She sat next to a woman with 3 sleeping children. She looked out the window at the tropical landscape, the street stalls, the potholes, the murals with gang names. She didn't recognize anything, Not streets, not accents, not faces. She had left Honduras as a battered woman looking for a future, and she returned as a foreigner who had given everything, to be left with nothing. When they arrived at the neighborhood where her relative lived, Lucia knocked on the door, hoping not to be a burden. They received her without enthusiasm, but without rejecting her. They offered her a room without a window, a mattress on the floor, and a cup of coffee. She accepted it all without complaining. And that night, for the first time in a long time, she cried out loud, not because of the deportation, but because of the absence. For the hole left by what breaks beyond repair. In the United States, no one knew about her for weeks. Not Sofia, not Diego, not the media. Lucia became invisible again, but this time, in her own land. Honduras wasn't waiting for her. There was no welcoming band, no hugs, no familiar voices calling her name from the other side of the arrivals hall. Just a sticky humidity, an endless line of taxis, and the same overcast sky that had seen her leave 20 years ago. But that sky was no longer the same, nor the country, nor her. Lucia got off the plane with a brown paper envelope containing the documents they had returned to her at the detention center. Nothing more. She had no suitcases, no hand luggage, not even a photograph. Her entire past had remained locked in a house north of Houston, in a small room next to the laundry area. The journey to her relative's house was long. She took an old bus, then a motorcycle taxi, and finally walked 10 blocks on a dirt road with improvised houses, skinny dogs, and barefoot children running between puddles. Her cousin, Marta, received her with a mixture of surprise and pity. "You looked like your mother when she got old," she said as she opened the door to her house. "But you have sadder eyes, Lucia." The house had a tin roof and block walls without plaster. They offered her a room in the back where they used to store old things. There was a mattress on the floor, a lame chair, and a fan that only worked if you hit it from the side. Lucia thanked without questioning anything. She was exhausted, in body, in soul, from waiting so long for something that never came. The first days passed like a silent film. She slept during the day. She hardly spoke. She sat in the yard at night listening to the sound of crickets and the neighborhood. Sometimes she wondered if she was alive or if she was just surviving. She tried to contact her children. Elvin, the oldest, now lived in Spain. He had a family, a job as a delivery man, and little desire to remember. "I thank you for everything, Mom," he told her by message. "But we're not the same anymore. I had to learn to live without you. I hope you learn too." The youngest, Marco, lived in La Ceiba. He didn't answer the calls or the messages. So many years had passed that any bond had become formal, cold, distant. Lucia understood, without anyone saying it, that she no longer formed an active part of their lives. Thus, in a matter of weeks, she faced a brutal truth. She had given 20 years to a family that didn't defend her, and had lost her own in the attempt. She had no home, no children nearby, no friends, no one. During the first months, she depended on Marta's charity, who offered her rice, beans, and some space. But even patience has its limit. "Look, Lucia," she said one day as they washed dishes, "I love you, but it's not enough anymore. I can't support another person. Maybe if you find something to sell or to do, you can get ahead." It wasn't meanness, it was reality. That's how things work in a country where everyone struggles to survive. So, Lucia decided to try. With the few dollars she had left from the brown envelope, she bought flour, oil, a little ground meat, and vegetables. She prepared empanadas, the same ones she made for the children in Houston when they came home from school. She put them in a borrowed basket and went to a corner in front of a public school. The first day she sold 15, the second 20, the third none. The fourth, someone bought 5 and told her they were the best he had tried in years. This is how her new routine began. She woke up before dawn, cooked in her cousin's small kitchen, went out with the basket hanging on her arm, sat under the shade of a tree, smiled politely, didn't talk much, just offered homemade empanadas, very tasty. Some looked at her with suspicion, others with tenderness. There were good days and bad days, but little by little her presence became part of the landscape. As if she had always been there, she never told her story, never said she had lived in the United States, or that she had raised 2 children as if they were her own, or that she had been part of a family that ended up forgetting her. She kept all that in a cardboard box she hid under her mattress. There she had her deportation documents, a card of St. Jude, a letter from Sophia, and a folded sheet where Diego had drawn a house with her standing at the door. Every night, before going to sleep, she opened that box, read the letter, looked at the drawing, and then in silence closed it. One rainy night, as she returned home with an empty basket, she stopped in front of a window where a television showed an international newscast. They ran a report on deported migrants. They interviewed a woman who told something similar to her story. Lucia lowered her gaze and kept walking. She was no longer news, no longer a viral case, no longer the caretaker of Houston. Now she was just another woman among thousands, trying to start over with the little she had left, her strength, her silence, and her dignity. At 6 a.m, when the sun was barely peeking through the grey clouds of the Honduran sky, Lucia was already in front of the stove, frying the first empanadas of the day. The oil sputtered, the steam stuck to her face, and the aroma of cumin and garlic filled the improvised kitchen of the room where she had been living for almost a year. It wasn't a house, it was a borrowed space, with walls that breathed humidity and a tin roof that creaked with each gust of wind. Sometimes leaks came in, other times insects. But Lucia had learned to live with less, much less, and still to remain standing. Life after deportation didn't resemble anything she had imagined. For years, she thought returning to her country would be like going back to the starting point, a moment of pause before taking momentum again. But when she arrived, she understood it wasn't a point of return. It was a leap into the void. In the town where she sold her empanadas, few knew who she was. No one asked too much. People came, bought, thanked. Some returned, others didn't. And she, every afternoon, counted the coins with the precision of someone who could no longer make mistakes. She lived with little, ate with little, moved with little. But inside, she continued carrying everything. Each night upon arriving at her room, she would leave the empty basket aside and sit on the bed with the cardboard box on her lap. It was her treasure, her secret. There she kept what she couldn't say out loud. Sophia's letters, a drawing from Diego, the bracelet woven with colored beads, a blurry photo of the children taken at a school party many years ago, a crumpled receipt with the address of the house where she lived for 2 decades, and the last letter she had received. It had arrived a few weeks after her deportation. The envelope had no return address, but Lucia immediately recognized Sophia's handwriting. She opened it with trembling hands. It was a sheet written in blue ink, without adornments, without empty promises. Dear Lucia, I don't know if this will reach you, but I need you to know. I searched for you in the house. I entered your room. Everything was just as you left it. Your things, your photos, your memories. Mom didn't want to talk about it. Dad neither. They said it was for legal security, that they couldn't do anything. But I know they could. I know they chose not to. I left the house 2 months ago. I live with my grandmother. I left. It hurt too much. But I carry your voice in my head every day. I cook your recipes. I pray with your holy card. And every time I doubt myself, I read this. Everything you give with love comes back. You are my family. And although you never signed it on paper, your love is tattooed in my life. I love you. Always. Sophia. Lucia read that letter at least 100 times. She kept it as if it were a charm. She folded it carefully and placed it at the top of the box. That letter was her home, her reward, her only certainty. As the months passed, the neighborhood people began calling her Doña Lucia. She was no longer invisible, nor the one who comes from the United States. She was simply herself. Some children helped her carry the basket. A lady lent her a spot in front of the school. A young man studying law offered to help her process a microlicense as a street vendor, and a retired teacher who listened to her every afternoon in the park said to her one day, "You speak as if you live between two worlds." Lucia smiled, lowered her gaze, and replied, "It's just that there are things one never completely leaves behind." She never saw Sofia or Diego again, nor did she expect to. But she didn't need to either. They were already with her, in her gestures, in her memories, in the silences that now hurt less. Sometimes she dreamed that she returned to Houston, that she entered the house through the backyard door, that the children came running to hug her, that Teresa, for the first time, looked her in the eyes and said, "I'm sorry." But upon waking, she accepted that scene would never come. One day, while arranging her empanadas on a tray, a little girl approached her with a coin in her hand and said, "My mom says you cook with your heart." "And what do you think?" Lucia asked her. "I think you cook with memories." And she wasn't wrong, because each empanada she sold carried a piece of history, of loss, of love, of giving, and also of rebirth. Because although she had been torn from a country that used her without protecting her, although she had been forgotten by those who said they loved her, although she had returned to a land that no longer felt like her own, Lucia was still standing, still alive, and above all, still loving. Not all stories end with justice. Not all end with redemption. Some simply end with dignity, silent, simple, but firm. And in that silence, Lucia found her new beginning. And if you enjoyed this story, you'll surely love the next one appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and turn on notifications. Until next time.